Hi, my name is Chris Sanders, and this is a speech about the Filipino culture for my COMM 303 class from Columbia College. A little bit of history about myself. I've been in the Navy 19 years, and in that I worked alongside Filipinos and visited the Philippines myself and really come to appreciate the rich culture of the country. Today I'd really like to talk about and help you understand the history, the economy, the culture, the food, and the etiquette of the Philippine people. Starting with the history, and I got most of this from philippinehistory.org as well as my own personal experience. The Philippines were initially settled by the Chinese in about 300 AD. From there, they would stay essentially Chinese for the next 1,000 years. In 1380, you saw a Malaysian Muslim influence in the south, and then only about 20 years later, you would see traders from Japan in the north. This eventually ended up as kind of an Asian fusion or an East Asian melting pot. They would actually stay primarily Asian until they were discovered by the West by Ferdinand Magellan when he was doing his circumnavigation for Spain under King Philip II, which is actually where they get their name, the Philippines. They would remain under Spanish rule for 356 years, and this actually affects their culture. Their current language, Tagayo, actually has a lot of Romantic language influence in it. You'll also see a lot of Spanish names as the norm in the Philippines. A lot of Rodriguez, a lot of Cruz, Ferdinands. You'd see a lot of this. In 1898, after the Spanish-American War, the Philippines was ceded to the United States. In the next about 40 years until World War II, they'd remain under the United States. After the Japanese invasion and then the U.S. pushing them back, that really strengthened the Filipino-American ties, but we did still give them their influence shortly after that. They have a government since then that's been established on the United States. You'll see it's a constitutional republic, and it has had the president, the legislative, and the judicial branches. The problem with this, though, is in the time that they've actually gained their independence, they've had a lot of issues with corruption, especially in the presidency. They've even seen 3 impeachments. And interestingly enough, the current president is probably the first anti-Western president that we've seen. Moving on to their economy. Their economy is about 40% agricultural, but 50% live below the poverty line. They only have a 9% unemployment rate, so this kind of leads me to believe that they have to maintain the multiple jobs just to kind of scrape by. And with 50% of them below the poverty line, even that's a challenge. This has resulted in a lot of overseas workers. The Philippines has 4% of their gross domestic product, which is roughly $7 billion, in healthcare, merchant seamen, household workers, and factory workers in other countries. The primary 3 here are Saudi Arabia, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, which is really a possession of China now, so it's mostly Chinese. But the Philippines economy is very westernized. If you're in the urban centers, you'll find malls, you'll find shops. You pay what the price is, there's no bartering. But in the rural areas, and you will still find it in the urban areas, you'll find open air markets where the primary method of trade is bartering, services or goods. On to culture. But before that, why do I care about all this so much? It's because these are major factors that contribute to the way they see the world and where they're coming from. They've only been independent for, roughly 60 years. Culturally, and I got most of this from quintessential.co.uk, they have 7,641 islands, isolated into 300,000 square miles. They have a population of 100 million, and in that they have 10 major ethno-linguistic groups. The primary languages spoken there are Tagalog or Filipino, you can call it either one, and English, which they got from us. Majority of this country religiously is Roman Catholic, and they can thank their Spanish roots for that. 80% are Roman Catholic. The next majority is the Muslims. Most of that influence is actually pushed into the south because of its proximity to Malaysia. They're really a marriage of East and West. You see a lot of East Asian values combined with the Western materialism and capitalism. Their rural life is still very Asian. They still have things like issues with lack of medicine, lack of water, irrigation, and they still cling to things like faith healers. According to Britannica.com, they really focus on an extended family. And this comes from the Asian influence of having multiple generations in the same household. But they're also very, very much about godparents and other friends of the family also living in there, and they can thank their Spanish roots for that. Most of their holidays are Christian, but they do observe the end of Ramadan and a couple of other Muslim holidays. They dress mostly Western, but you'll still see some Asian influence in things like the malong, which is a Muslim influenced garb, which is a colorful kind of cloth tube worn by women. You'll also see the barong, which you'll see in urban areas. That's a shirt that men wear that's very colorful. And the terno, which is, if you've ever seen like the Miss Universe competitions, you'll typically see the Filipino representative in this. It's a long dress. It's typically got butterfly arms and kind of high shoulders. Moving on to food. According to everyculture.com, the Filipino culture celebrates 5 meals a day. These are mostly rice-based. They're so into rice that they actually harvest 3 crops a year. They observe the typical lunch, dinner, and breakfast that we do, but they also observe in-betweens, so your brunch or your in-between lunch and dinner meals. They typically cook on gas stoves, typically outside, sometimes wood or charcoal fires. They don't use table knives. Eating with your hands is very accepted, and they serve things family style. They're very about making sure everybody gets some, so it's very polite to initially refuse food offered, making sure that it gets around, and then taking your portion. Typically, the last portion will get left in the pan because nobody wants to be that last person to take it. They have something called lechon, which is a suckling pig that they serve at celebrations, and you can actually gauge the size of the celebration by the size of the pig they're serving. In other words, how many guests are you really going to feed? They also eat dog meat, but that's mostly illegal now because of rabies issues, but it is considered a delicacy. They also have something called balut, which is a duck egg that has been allowed to develop a little bit and then fermented. I've had it myself. It's not something I want to eat again, but it was very interesting. On to their etiquette. Quintessential.com gave me most of the information on this. They're very into accommodating other people. Most of their culture is about making sure everybody else around them is comfortable. They're food oriented, and they strive to maintain a sense of propriety and accommodation. Where are you really going to see this? It's in their business etiquette. They have that traditional kind of family hierarchy where you have a high power distance in between the father and the children. Well, you actually see this between the boss and the employees. They're very married to their company. They're very into making sure that it does well. It's very hierarchical. Their interpersonal relationships, they're very about the family group and about the social groups. So losing face is a big deal. So you don't see a lot of criticism in Filipino companies because of how that can get taken as a loss of face. Their social stratification is interesting. I got this from everyculture.com. They really appreciate education. It's a means to get up. And because they're so westernized, they're very capitalistic, and they really try to wear their status symbols in their houses. Having a car is huge, and then the way they dress. So education is a means to get to that. Money is seen as power, much like you'll see it in America. They will gauge status off of your wardrobe and off the schools you attended and where you're from. So I hope that my discussion so far has encompassed a little bit of their history, a little bit of their economy, some of their culture, their food, and their etiquette. Obviously, I don't have enough time to cover all of that, but I appreciate your time, and thanks a lot.